I think we've made a huge mistake. I think we're talking about mental health more than ever before. Actually, more people are in therapy than ever before. And yet anxiety, depression, loneliness, and overwhelm actually continue to move in the wrong direction. And that doesn't really make any sense, unless we're maybe trying to solve the wrong problem. And I think that's exactly maybe what we've done. We've spent years treating mental health symptoms while completely missing the cause. And if we don't figure it out, I think we're going to be in a situation where we keep producing generations of people who struggle to handle stress, adversity, criticism, uncertainty, and everyday life. So in this video, I want to explain why what we're doing isn't working and what we should be doing instead. But before I explain that, I should probably tell you a little bit more about where this perspective is coming from. I'm Dr. Jennifer Prohaska, and I'm a clinical psychologist. Over the last 15 years, I've worked in some of the most stressful hospital units, helping people recover from very serious, life-altering physical injuries. And then I worked in oncology, helping people prepare for death, dying. And then I worked in forensic psychology. I worked in law enforcement and along some of the most elite tactical teams and high-performance professionals in the entire country. I've conducted thousands of psychological evaluations, and I've spent a whole career studying how people respond to stress, adversity, trauma, and uncertainty, and helping employers also predict and control who can handle stress and who's going to wash out. And through all of those experiences, I kept noticing the same pattern. The factors that seemed to determine who handled stress well and who struggled weren't really developed in that stressful moment or that crisis. They were actually already there before the crisis ever arrived. And that's what eventually led me to a realization. One of the biggest mistakes we've made as a society is assuming that most people still, even nowadays, naturally develop the ability to mentally, emotionally, and psychologically manage the world around them. For most of human history, nobody really sat down and taught emotional regulation, resilience, distress tolerance, adaptability, responsibility, not as like formal subjects. They didn't have to. Those lessons were really built into like everyday family life, social experiences, team sports, social organizations like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and spiritual communities. Through those experiences, people gradually and naturally learned responsibility, hardship, conflict resolution, disappointment, and uncertainty. Those institutions did most of the heavy lifting in teaching children how to become capable adults. People learned how to recover from failure, navigate conflict, tolerate uncertainty, and keep functioning when life didn't really go according to plan. And because of those thousands of ordinary experiences, most people developed well enough to handle the normal demands of adulthood by the time they got to adulthood. But then something really changed. Those experiences that had traditionally prepared people for adulthood started occurring less and less. So let me give you just an example. Take something as simple as finding information. Today, if you want to know something, all you have to do is pull out your phone and you have an answer in like seconds. But there was actually a time when like finding information actually required effort and planning. And that had to do with things like going to the library, finding the right section, potentially asking the librarian for help, finding the book, and looking up the topic. Oh, by the way, then sifting through paragraphs in that encyclopedia that weren't really relevant to what you really wanted to know. And then once you finally found the information you needed, then you needed to plan what you were going to do with that information. The information gathering wasn't the only thing you were getting out of that experience. You were actually learning things like patience, persistence, problem solving, and how to tolerate not having an immediate answer. The same thing happened in sports and school as well. There was a time, I remember these, when a coach could criticize your performance in front of your teammates, or a teacher could correct you in front of the whole class. That wasn't always comfortable. Sometimes, yes, it was embarrassing. And sometimes it actually even hurt your feelings. But you actually learned how to tolerate criticism without falling apart. You learned how to be uncomfortable without interpreting every discomfort as actual harm to you. And then there's another example here too. Before texting, if you had a disagreement with a friend, you usually had to deal with that face to face. You couldn't just disappear behind a screen, write something, reread it, edit it, rewrite it very carefully with your response and then send it. You actually, unbelievably, had to walk up to somebody, have the conversation, feel the awkwardness, navigate the conflict, and then figure out how to move forward. Those may seem like super small things, but for generations, those ordinary experiences were repetition and repetition over and over, teaching people how to function in the real world. So simultaneously, one of the other negatives is that this tech boom happened, and what basically most people's lives also changed because of this, and they became more and more convenient with less and less hardship. The need to tolerate discomfort or distress or waiting to get information or things to be fixed, that went away. And as things became more and more instantaneous, we lost the ability to tolerate distress. There was less and less need for delayed gratification, and tolerating distress became less relevant. All the while, and at the same time in society, something else happened. Society became increasingly increasingly focused on protecting people from experiences that might negatively affect their confidence, their self-esteem, or their emotional well-being. And then there was this not so subtle push from the parenting gurus of the time to build kids' self-esteem by protecting basically your kid from negative experiences, developing as much positive self-esteem as possible. The promise through this was that if you protect them from having failure or hardship, you're actually giving your kid the best chance at a good life. And if you didn't protect your kid from failure or hardship, basically you were creating a psychopath. Ultimately, all these forces converged and led to something. People started experiencing less and less hardship, less discomfort. They had less responsibility, they had less need for delayed gratification, and less opportunity overall to fail and recover. And over time, many of those experiences that had historically helped build that psychological strength were actually treated as things to be avoided rather than things to be worked through. And at roughly the same time, another cultural shift was also taking place. So for about 2 to 3 decades, popular psychology and parenting culture became heavily influenced by what's now called the self-esteem movement. And the belief was simple. If children developed high self-esteem, then they could be more and more successful, happier, and better adjusted as adults. And if experiences damage that self-esteem, those experiences could be minimized or should be minimized as possible. And as a result, criticism, failure, rejection, and other uncomfortable experiences increasingly became viewed as threats to a child's well-being rather than normal parts of human development. Over time, those ideas became so embedded throughout parenting culture, they also became embedded in school processes and popular psychology. So an entire generation of parents was taught that one of the most important jobs that you could possibly have was protecting a child's self-esteem. The intentions were very pure. However, the outcome was not. We became so focused on protecting self-esteem that we actually stopped asking how self-esteem was built in the first place. And one unintended consequence was that many children developed fewer opportunities to develop competence through that hardship. Good people acting with really good intentions gradually removed many of those experiences that had historically helped people build psychological strength. And for a while, nobody really noticed any potential negatives of that. The changes happened really gradually. There would be like one little less awkward social interaction to have to navigate here, and one little less failure over here where you had to come back and try again. But eventually, little by little, the absence of those experiences added up, and the consequences became really impossible to ignore. More and more young adults actually started to experience overwhelm. Basically, they were expressing that to their parents now. They started avoiding trying new things, especially if they could fail at them. They also basically meant that they would avoid participating with their peers socially, and that their world actually ended up getting smaller and smaller. They started avoiding opportunities where they might fail, where they might look foolish, or even feel uncomfortable. They stopped trying out for teams. They stopped applying for opportunities where maybe they wouldn't get it or weren't guaranteed to get it. They stopped putting themselves in situations where rejection, criticism, or embarrassment were even possible. So their social circles became smaller. Their worlds actually became smaller. Normal disagreements also started feeling overwhelming or catastrophic to them, and normal critique, correction, or performance feedback started feeling really personal because they weren't used to it. And as one would naturally expect, the more and more people reached adolescence and young adulthood without fully developing the skills required to handle that phase of their life. Ordinary challenges that previous generations viewed as just part of life started to be experienced by people now as significant psychological distress. And that's where the panic started. Parents looked around and realized, oh, my children, they're struggling with stress, uncertainty, conflict, criticism, setbacks, and adversity that we were able to handle. Schools noticed it, employers noticed it, mental health professionals started noticing it, and everybody agreed on one thing: something was wrong. We could see it clearly in the symptoms, but we actually came to the wrong cause or conclusion of what caused those symptoms. We correctly recognized that people were struggling, but we incorrectly assumed that we were looking at a mental health problem. So the problem was handed off to the professionals. That meant therapists, psychologists, and counselors. What had originally always been considered a normal part of human psychological development now became a therapeutic problem. So we mistook a developmental failure for a potential mental health problem. And that mistake changed everything. So once we decided that this was a mental health problem, the solution seemed obvious. We naturally built solutions designed for addressing mental health problems. So if people were struggling, then we'll get them into therapy, we'll give them resources, give them more education around mental health issues, give them more psychological language. That's exactly what you would do if the problem were a mental health problem. That all makes sense. And yet something strange happened. The strange thing is that many indicators of overall mental health and well-being continue to move in the wrong direction despite all of those efforts. So for example, more Americans are participating in therapy and mental health treatment than at any point in history. In fact, in the last 2 decades, mental health utilization has increased from approximately 7% in 1999 to 23.9% in 2023. Mental health awareness has never been higher, and psychological language is basically part of an everyday conversation now. But depression rates have also increased from about 8% in 2014 to 13% in 2023, which is a 60% increase over a decade. Loneliness and isolation has become so common that the Surgeon General has described it as an epidemic, with basically approximately half of US adults reporting experiencing some kind of loneliness. And there are many indicators also suggest that people are reporting like higher levels of anxiety, stress, overwhelm, and dissatisfaction with overall quality of life than previous generations. So something doesn't add up. We are confusing understanding a problem with possessing the skills necessary to solve it. We've talked about mental health more than ever. The increase in awareness is also more than ever. We expanded access more than ever. We normalized seeking help more than ever. Yet many indicators suggest we are actually becoming more adaptable, more resilient, or more psychologically capable. The problem is that mental health treatment and psychological development are very much not the same thing. Therapy was designed to help people who are impaired, overwhelmed, traumatized, or stuck. It was really never designed to be a primary way that society develops psychological strength. And somewhere along the way, we also started confusing those two things, because knowing you're anxious is absolutely not the same thing as being able to tolerate some anxiety. Understanding why criticism hurts is not the same thing as being able to handle criticism well. Being able to label an emotion is not the same thing as regulating it. And talking about adversity is not the same thing as adapting to adversity. Feeling validated is also not the same thing as becoming more capable. Those are fundamentally different things. One helps people understand their experience. The other helps people navigate that experience. And over time, we've become increasingly skilled at identifying distress while becoming far less capable and far less intentional about developing the ability to handle it. And once you look at the problem through that lens, the solution actually becomes fairly obvious. If society changed in ways that reduce the natural development of important psychological skills, and those missing skills produce symptoms like anxiety, avoidance, overwhelm, loneliness, and difficulty navigating everyday life, then it shouldn't surprise us that treating the symptoms did not fundamentally solve that problem, because the cause was still present. The skill deficits never went away. We were treating the downstream consequences while leaving the upstream problem largely untouched. Which means if we actually want different outcomes, we have to go back to the original source of the problem. We have to stop focusing exclusively on the symptoms and start developing the skills that were missing in that first place. The reality is that if you get the diagnosis wrong, you're almost guaranteed to get the treatment wrong too. And I think that's exactly what has happened here. So, for example, I want you to imagine somebody develops chronic knee pain. And instead of figuring out why the knee actually hurts, we focus on basically helping them understand and cope with the pain. We teach them more about pain. We help them understand their pain. We give them language to describe their pain. And we validate that the pain is real. And all of those things, of course, are a little bit helpful. But if the knee pain is actually being caused by an underlying injury, weakness, or deterioration, then none of those interventions actually address the real problem. The symptoms are real, the pain is real, but the pain itself is not the cause. And that's what I think we've done psychologically. We saw anxiety, loneliness, overwhelm, avoidance, and decreased functioning, and we correctly recognized those symptoms are real, but then we treated the symptoms as if they were the problem itself, instead of asking, hey, what's the skills here? What's the capacities? And what developmental experiences are we missing underneath them? And then addressing those. So what are the psychological skills necessary to navigate stress, adversity, uncertainty, conflict, failure, and everyday life? But when you look across the entire field of psychology, resilience research, leadership research, human development, and even common sense, the same themes tend to emerge over and over again. People need the ability to understand themselves, to regulate their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, to stay grounded in values when things become really difficult, to adapt to life when things don't go as planned, and to interpret situations realistically. They also need to build strong relationships with other people. And those really aren't therapy concepts, those are psychological life skills. And when those skills aren't developed, people tend to handle adversity poorly. But when those skills are in place, people tend to crush adversity. They run through adversity so well, even when life throws them a huge challenge. Over the years, I've spent a lot of time studying and teaching those skills. In my work, I actually categorize them into 6 main criteria, if you will, 6 main traits. So the people who handle life's challenges well tend to score highly in these 6 categories: self-awareness, self-regulation, values, mental flexibility, accuracy, connection. And the good news is that all of these skills are very trainable. So what would actually happen if we intentionally taught these skills? Because up until now, the trend has been to spend years and years and years asking, well, how do we reduce the symptoms of suffering? But maybe the better question is, how do we develop people who are capable of navigating suffering when it inevitably arrives? Because adversity is not going away, uncertainty is not going away, failure is always a risk, and stress is an inevitable part of life. The question is whether we are intentionally developing those skills required to handle them instead of just chasing symptoms. I firmly believe that people can become stronger, more capable, and more prepared for whatever life puts in front of them, but only if we're willing to stop chasing symptoms and start developing the skills that allow people to handle adversity, uncertainty, failure, and hardship in the first place. Because the goal isn't to create a world without struggle. The goal is to create people who are capable of navigating it. And that's a conversation I think we should be having. Look, life will always be difficult, but people can become more capable of handling it. And if you believe in that too, I'd love to have you follow along.